Close your eyes for a moment. Not to sleep, not yet, but to travel. Go back 30,000 years. You're somewhere in what we'd now call Central Europe, and the sun has been gone for 2 hours. The temperature has already dropped below freezing. But you're not cold yet because you're close, very close to a fire that someone has been nursing since before dusk. The flames are low and orange. Shadows ripple across a limestone overhang above you. The smell in the air is a compound thing. Wood smoke, roasting fat, wet earth, pine resin, the faint musk of pelts drying nearby. Someone is turning a hunch of deer over the coals. The outer layer has darkened and split, and the juice that seeps out hisses when it hits the stone. A child 4 or 5 years old, bare feet pulled up under a skin wrap, watches the meat with an expression you recognize completely. Pure anticipation. Hunger sharpened into focus by proximity to food. Beside the child, an older woman is pressing a flat stone rhythmically over something, seeds perhaps, or a dried root, grinding it into a coarse paste that will be shaped into a small cake and set near the coals to harden. She does this without looking. Her hands know the motion the way your hands know how to type, how to stir, how to open a jar. Muscle memory built from 10,000 repetitions over a lifetime. There are tubers in the coals, round, dirty, wrapped in leaves that have gone black at the edges. Someone dug them this afternoon with a stick of hardened wood and carried them for 2 miles. Tomorrow, if they're lucky, there will be more. Tonight, there's enough. That distinction, enough, not certain, governed almost every meal your ancestors ever ate. Further from the fire, 2 men are cracking long bones on a flat river stone, extracting the marrow with practiced efficiency, their knuckles stained dark with the effort. The sound is rhythmic, a dull crack, then a pause, then the wet sound of something being scooped out with a finger. They eat it immediately. Directly from the bone, the fat coating their lips. Nobody thinks this is primitive. This is just the best part. This has always been the best part. This scene is not theater. It is not a museum drama. It is the literal foundation of everything you are. The architecture of your gut, the size and metabolic cost of your brain, the arrangement of your teeth, the depth of your sleep, the way your body lurches into alert when it smells cooking meat. All of it was shaped by meals like this one. Repeated across thousands of generations, across dozens of different landscapes, under every conceivable condition of abundance and catastrophe. We are in the most precise biological sense built from Stone Age dinners. But what does that actually mean? The phrase Stone Age diet has been stretched so thin by popular culture that it has nearly lost meaning. It conjures either cavemen gnawing mammoth bones or modern influences arranging grass-fed beef and avocado on slate boards. Neither is wrong. Exactly. Both miss almost everything that matters. The true story is older, stranger, and more relevant to your body tonight than any diet book currently in print. Here's the first thing to understand. We're not talking about a single diet. We're talking about roughly 3 and 12 million years of human and pre-human eating. 3.5 million years of bodies responding to environments, climates, catastrophes, innovations, and accidents. To put that in perspective, modern Homo sapiens, our species, has existed for perhaps 300,000 years. The story we're about to walk through begins more than 10 times earlier than that, with creatures who would have looked only vaguely human to your eye, but whose dietary decisions echo in your biology right now, tonight, as you lie here. The Stone Age itself breaks into periods. The long Paleolithic, roughly 3.4 million to 12,000 years ago. The shorter Mesolithic, 12,000 to 8,000 years ago, depending on the region, and the Neolithic, when agriculture arrived and changed nearly everything. But these labels are shortcuts. The reality was messier and more interesting. Multiple human species sometimes shared the same landscapes and the same food sources. Climates lurched between ice ages and warm periods on roughly 100,000-year cycles, each swing reshaping available plants, animals, and humans alike. A diet that kept you alive in Ice Age Germany would have been nearly useless in tropical West Africa. A strategy that worked during a warm interglacial would fail completely when the glaciers returned. Homo habilis, handyman, appears in the fossil record around 2.4 million years ago. Small, partially tree-adapted, with a brain noticeably larger than earlier apes. Then Homo erectus, taller, longer-legged, fire-using, world-traveling, surviving for nearly 2 million years across a range that stretched from Spain to Indonesia. Then Neanderthals in Europe, Denisovans across Asia, archaic Homo sapiens in Africa, different lineages, different bodies, different food strategies, all eating their way through geological time, all leaving traces in rock, bone, and ultimately in you. The pages ahead will trace what each of these people actually ate. Not the sanitized version, not the Instagram version, the real version. Risky, seasonal, inventive, often disgusting by modern standards, and nutritionally remarkable in ways that modern science is only beginning to fully appreciate. We'll follow our earliest relatives to the edges of predator kills, where they learn to crack bones for the fat inside. We'll crouch with Homo erectus around the first controlled fires and watch cooking reorganize the human body from the inside out. We'll wade through tidal shallows with people who figured out that the ocean's edge was one of the most reliable pantries on Earth. We'll sit with Neanderthals around stone-boiled stews and examine what dental plaque 50,000 years old tells us about medicinal plant use. We'll dig into the forgotten protein landscape of insects and grubs that quietly supplemented every foraging diet ever lived. We'll trace the first fermented foods, the first storage pits, the first deliberate effort to carry abundance forward through time. And then we'll arrive at agriculture, the revolution that fed more people, but in a very real sense made many of them sicker. And we'll follow that thread all the way forward to you in a body designed for a world that no longer quite exists. There's no prescription at the end of this, no diet plan, no meal prep guide. What there is, hopefully, is a deeper and more honest understanding of what you're working with when you eat, which is one of the most complex, adaptive, historically layered physiological systems on the planet. Understanding it doesn't require romanticizing the past. Our ancestors' lives were hard in ways that would break most of us. But understanding it does require taking seriously the idea that your appetite, your digestion, your relationship with hunger and fullness were not designed for a world of supermarkets and midnight delivery apps. They were designed for something older, much older. So let's go back, all the way back, before fields, before villages, before bronze and iron and the wheel, before even the earliest hearths. Back to the moment when some clever, hungry creature first picked up a rock and realized it could be used to get at something the lions had left behind. That moment changed everything, and in a sense it's still changing you. The oldest direct evidence of our ancestors eating meat doesn't come from a dramatic hunt. There's no spear embedded in a mammoth rib, no scene of cooperative takedown preserved in stone. What we have instead is humbler and in its own way more astonishing. Cut marks on bones from a site called Dika in Ethiopia, dated to 3.4 million years ago, made by stone tools pressed against the ribbon leg bones of large animals that something else had already killed. Someone arrived after the lions left. They pressed rough stone flakes against the carcass and scraped. We know this because the marks are still there, visible in fossil bone under the right light and angle, the angle of the scrape, the depth, the pattern. These were not random scratches. They were purposeful. Someone was trying to get at meat and marrow, and they had the presence of mind to bring a tool sharp enough to do it. The being who made these marks was probably not in our genus yet, Australopithecus afarensis or something nearby on the family tree. Small-bodied, small-raned, still spending significant time in trees. But they were hungry and clever, and they had noticed something that would turn out to be one of the most consequential observations in evolutionary history. The predators were wasting something. A lion kills a zebra and eats 30, 40, maybe 50 pounds of meat. Then it rests. Hyenas move in and take their share. Vultures descend. By the time all the large scavengers have had their turn, the carcass looks thoroughly picked. But look closer. The long bones are still largely intact. The skulls are cracked only partially. Inside those bones, sealed in calcium tubes, is something rich and calorie-dense that almost no one else has figured out how to reach efficiently. Marrow. Bone. Marrow is essentially compressed fat and protein. One of the most nutrient-dense foods in nature, predators can crush some bones, but not with the surgical efficiency needed to extract marrow from every fur and humerus at a kill site. They leave it behind. They leave thousands of calories sitting there in the African sun, inaccessible to anyone without hands and the idea of a tool. A clever ape with a rock could have that food to itself. This was the discovery. Not cooking, not farming, not even hunting. Just the recognition that stone could smash bone and that what was inside the bone was worth having. It sounds simple, but sitting with the implications reveals how transformative it was. Suddenly, a creature too small and slow to be. A predator had access to a high-quality food source that almost no competition was exploiting. While the lions slept and the vultures quarreled over gristle, Early hominins could arrive at the wreckage of someone else's kill and quietly extract the richest calories that remained. This strategy required bodies that could travel. Kill sites were scattered across enormous territories, which meant bipedalism became increasingly valuable. Walking upright on two legs isn't fast, but it's extraordinarily energy efficient for covering distance. It also freed the hands, which could now carry tools, which meant you could bring your bone-smashing rock with you, rather than hoping to find a suitable stone at every carcass. The logic of scavenging also rewarded intelligence in a very specific way. To scavenge effectively, you needed to read the landscape. You needed to recognize the circling of vultures from a distance, the universal signal that something large had died. You needed to know which water, holes and valley corridors produced kills most reliably, which times of year herds of prey moved through which areas, and which carcasses were worth the risk of approach. A brain capable of holding mental maps, of tracking patterns across seasons, of anticipating where food might be found before it was visible. That brain had a survival advantage, and the nutrients in the marrow it was helping to extract were in a beautiful loop, precisely the nutrients needed to build and maintain a larger, more capable brain. The social dynamics of this lifestyle must have been intense. Competing with hyenas, animals capable of crushing bone with their own jaws, for access to carcasses, while keeping an eye on whether the original predator was still nearby required coordination and communication. One small human approaching a fresh kill alone was vulnerable. A group moving together, making noise, throwing rocks, presenting a more formidable front that was survivable. Coordination thus became not merely useful but potentially life-saving, and this probably pushed the development of more complex social behavior and early communication. There is also the sheer audacity of the approach to consider. Moving toward a carcass where hyenas are still feeding requires something that looks a lot like courage, or at minimum a calculated willingness to accept risk for the sake of a meal. Over time, groups that could coordinate this kind of bold collective action would have had consistent access to better food than solitary individuals or timid groups. Social bravery, the capacity to move toward danger together, was being selected for quietly at every contested carcass on the African savanna. There's also the marrow itself to consider. Bone marrow is rich in the exact nutrients that brain tissue requires. Omega-3 fatty acids, iron, zinc, B vitamins, complete proteins. Access to these nutrients consistently across hundreds of thousands of years did something remarkable. Brain size began to increase. Not rapidly, not dramatically at first, but steadily. The pattern is there in the fossil record. Generation after generation, a slight expansion of the brain case, a slight improvement in cognitive capacity, a slight increase in the ability to remember where productive kill sites were, to communicate about them, to coordinate access to them, and those slightly smarter individuals survived better, reproduced more successfully, passed those genes forward. Natural selection running on bone marrow. By 2 million years ago, human brain size had increased by roughly 50% compared to our earlier ancestors. That is not coincidence. That is dieting the organ that would eventually write symphonies, build cathedrals, and lie awake at night worrying about whether it was getting enough omega-3s. The scavenger's table was never safe. Hominin fossils from this period sometimes carry tooth marks from leopards. Some show evidence of having been consumed, not just killed accidentally, but eaten. This was not a comfortable existence. Every meal at a carcass came with the knowledge that something larger might arrive at any moment and take an interest in you rather than the bones. The fossil record is littered with evidence of this risk. Healed wounds, sudden deaths, the bone signatures of violent ends, and yet the calories were worth the risk. And slowly over hundreds of thousands of years, the balance began to shift. These scavengers grew smarter, better coordinated, better at reading landscapes and predicting where food would be. Their tools improved from simple sharp flakes to more deliberately shaped points. Their range expanded. They learned to move faster between sites, to read animal behavior, to anticipate danger and avoid it more effectively. They were not yet hunters, not in any systematic sense. But they were no longer simply the bottom of the food chain either. They occupied an unusual niche, the crafty middle, living off the leftovers of apex predators while quietly growing brains large enough to eventually become something much more formidable. Everything that came after, fire, hunting, agriculture, civilization, traces a line back to this. Desperate creatures on an African plain, smashing bones in the dust, getting at the fat that the lions couldn't reach. accidentally feeding the brains that would one day understand what they were doing. Imagine the energy cost of eating raw food, not a salad, raw meat, raw roots pulled from hard soil, raw seeds with their protective coatings intact. Your digestive system has to do everything from scratch, break down tough cell walls, denature proteins, gelatinize starches, neutralize plant defenses. This takes time, metabolic energy, and a gut large enough and muscular enough to handle the processing load. Gorillas spend roughly 6 hours a day just chewing. Chimpanzees barely less. Raw food is work, not just to find and prepare, but to digest. Your digestive system running on raw food is like an engine, burning low-grade fuel at high revs. It works, but most of the energy goes into keeping the engine running rather than powering the vehicle. Fire changed all of that. Heat does the work before food enters the mouth. It breaks down collagen in meat, turning fibrous connective tissue into something tender and easily digested. It ruptures plant cell walls, releasing nutrients that would otherwise pass through the gut unabsorbed. It gelatinizes starch in roots and tubers, converting tough, bitter, sometimes toxic lumps into something sweet and calorically accessible. It kills pathogens and parasites, dramatically reducing the immune burden of every meal. It reduces chewing time dramatically and cuts the energy cost of digestion by as much as 50%. That freed energy had to go somewhere. And based on what happens in the fossil record around the time controlled fire first appears roughly 1 million years ago at Wondervert Cave in South Africa, possibly earlier in contested sites scattered across Africa and Asia. It went into the brain. The anatomical evidence is striking. Around 1.8 million years ago, right in the window when fire use was either developing or becoming more systematic, human bodies begin to change in a coordinated way. Guts shrink. Teeth become smaller. The massive jaw muscles that earlier hominins needed to process raw food begin to reduce, allowing the skull to become more gracile and rounded. The brain case expands. These are not independent changes. They form a coherent package, a body adapting to cooked food, shedding equipment it no longer needs, redirecting resources toward the organ that was paying the biggest cognitive dividends. This is the essence of what primatologist Richard Wrangham calls the cooking hypothesis. That control of fire and systematic cooking was not merely useful for our ancestors, but was the biological catalyst that allowed human brains to grow to their extraordinary modern size. The brain is metabolically expensive. It consumes about 20% of your body's energy budget, while constituting only 2% of your body weight. For most animals, that trade-off would be ruinous. It would require either a vast increase in food intake or a dramatic reduction in the energy available for everything else. But with cooking, suddenly the caloric surplus was available. The gut could shrink, freeing up the metabolic budget that had been running it, and those freed calories could flow upward into the expanding brain. The brain could grow because the gut no longer needed to be enormous to fuel it. The evidence isn't just theoretical. Comparative anatomy supports it clearly. Among living primates, there is a consistent inverse relationship between gut size and brain size. Gorillas have enormous guts relative to their body weight and relatively small brains. Humans have small guts and enormous brains. The line between these two extremes is quite plausibly drawn by fire. The social consequences of fire may have been as profound as the anatomical ones, and they played out across a much faster timescale. Before fire, sunset meant danger. The safest behavior was to find a tree or a cliff ledge and wait for dawn. There was nothing productive to do in the dark. Predators were better adapted to the night than you were. Sleep came early because the alternative was just sitting in the dark being afraid. The social life of a pre-fire group was compressed into daylight hours, always with one eye on the horizon for large cats. Fire changed the meaning of evening. It pushed predators back. Animals that hunt by smell and stealth are cautious around flames and smoke. It provided warmth, extending the range of environments where humans could survive overnight without finding natural shelter. And it created something entirely new in evolutionary history. A gathering point, a place to return to, a center of gravity for social life. For the first time, there was a reason for a group to assemble after dark and stay together. And what do you do when you're warm, fed, and safe, sitting in a circle with people you depend on? You talk. You share information about where food was found today and where it might be tomorrow. You teach the children things they need to know. You tell stories about the hunt that went wrong last week and what you learned from it. You argue, make peace, form alliances, arrange marriages. You make someone laugh. You fall asleep listening to someone else's voice and the sound of the fire. And something in your nervous system relaxes in a way it can't quite manage in silence and darkness. The hearth became a classroom, a court, a theater. Language certainly predated cooking, but fire created the social context in which complex communication became not just useful but essential. Oral tradition, the passing of accumulated knowledge across generations, probably crystallized around cooking fires. And this knowledge included critically food knowledge. Which roots were safe raw and which needed? Cooking? Which plants became toxic in which seasons? How long to cook different meats? Which combinations caused problems and which did not? This was survival-grade information, and it had to be transmitted carefully, deliberately, to every generation. Cooking was also, perhaps unexpectedly, the beginning of preservation. Smoke from the fire would permeate nearby meat, slowing spoilage by denaturing the surface proteins that bacteria use as a foothold. For the first time in evolutionary history, it became possible to have surplus, to cook more than you could eat immediately to carry food forward in time. A surplus, even a small one, changes everything about how a social group functions. It creates the possibility of sharing beyond the immediate moment, of obligation, of reciprocity, of planning. You can give food to someone who helped you last week. You can set some aside for an elder who can no longer hunt. You can feed a child who is sick and unable to forage. The ethics of human social life, the elaborate architecture of obligation and care that distinguishes us from every other species, may have its deepest roots in the moment when a cooked meal first lasted long enough to be shared across time. The cooking fire was not merely a way to make food safer and more digestible. It was a reorganization of human time, human space, and human society around a warm, crackling center that still pulls at something deep in us every time we sit near a flame. Every barbecue, every dinner party, every family gathered around a kitchen stove, all of it echoes something that began with a spark and a piece of dried grass somewhere in southern Africa 1,000,000 years ago. We are not built for speed. Put a healthy human against a horse, a deer, a wolf, or almost any large mammal in a sprint, and the human loses badly. We're not built for strength either. A chimpanzee has roughly 3 times the upper body strength of a man, and we left the great apes behind on that evolutionary branch long ago. We have no claws, no venom, no particularly impressive teeth. A lion looks at us and sees prey, not competition. What we have is something stranger, and in the long run more deadly. The ability to run at a moderate pace for an extraordinarily long time in conditions of heat that would incapacitate almost any other large mammal on Earth. This is the basis of persistence hunting, the practice of chasing prey not at killing speed, but at the prey's emergency sprint speed, forcing it to overheat while the hunter remains thermorulated and capable. Humans cool through evaporation. We have over 2 million sweat glands distributed across our bodies, and we can dump heat at a rate that no other large mammal matches. Meanwhile, most of our prey cool by panting, an inefficient system that cannot operate at full capacity during sustained running because the breathing rhythm is locked to the gait cycle. They can sprint, they can recover, but they cannot run indefinitely at high speed in midday heat without their core temperature climbing toward dangerous levels. The hunter knows this, even if they don't know the physiology behind it. They know that if they can keep the animal moving, they can keep the animal moving. If they can arrive just as it has caught its breath, just as its temperature has peaked, and force it to run again, eventually it will stop running altogether. Not from exhaustion in the way we usually mean it, but from something closer to heat stroke. The animal simply cannot cool itself fast enough to sustain flight, and then the hunter walks up and kills it. Anthropologists have documented this technique among the sand of the Kalahari in the 20th century, capturing on film what must have been practiced for hundreds of thousands of years before anyone thought to record it. It is not theory. It is a technique refined over vast stretches of time written in human anatomy. The enlarged Achilles tendon that acts as a spring returning energy with each stride. The massive gluteus maximus that stabilizes the body during running but is largely redundant for walking. The enlarged semicircular canals in the inner ear that improve balance during head movement. The long, spring-loaded foot arch that stores and returns energy. The relatively hairless skin that allows sweat to evaporate freely from the largest possible surface area. We are persistence hunting machines. Every anatomical feature that makes us look strange compared to other primates. The long legs, the short arms, the hairless skin, the big butt. Makes sense when you understand that our bodies were shaped over millions of years for the specific task of chasing prey until physics took our side. But what our ancestors actually wanted from the hunt was not always the muscle meat that modern food culture valorizes. They were after fat. Specifically the richest fat deposits, brain, bone marrow, organ fat, the deposits around kidneys and in the abdominal cavity. These were the prizes. Fat delivers more than twice the calories per gram as either protein or carbohydrates. And in a world where starvation was always a possibility, caloric density was survival. You could carry it. Your body could store it. It could fuel you through days when nothing else was available. Eat nothing but lean muscle meat. Rabbit starvation, early explorers called it. And you develop a dangerous condition. The liver can only process a certain amount of protein before the metabolic load becomes toxic, producing a buildup of ammonia and urea that causes weakness, diarrhea, and eventually death. Fat has no such ceiling. Fat can constitute the majority of your caloric intake, and your body will thrive on it, provided it's the right kind. Which animal fat rich in saturated and monounsaturated fatty acids very much is. Early hunters understood this not in biochemical terms, but through lived experience. You ate everything, you prioritized the richest parts, and you wasted nothing. Archaeological sites make this clear. Bones cracked systematically for marrow, skulls broken to access the brain. These weren't random acts of destruction. They were precise, informed extractions. People knew which bones held the richest marrow, knew the angle and force required to open them without shattering the contents, knew which organs to consume first before they spoiled, and which could be carried back to camp. The liver was almost always eaten on site immediately. Rich in vitamins and minerals, it deteriorated quickly and was too valuable to leave. The fat surrounding the kidneys, often called leaf fat, was a delicacy in many cultures and likely was in the Stone Age too. The brain, rich in DHA and other fatty acids critical for neural function, was treated as a prize. The hunting itself was also deeply seasonal and knowledge-intensive. You had to understand migration routes, drinking patterns, seasonal fat cycles. Prey animals are leanest in late winter, fattest in early autumn before cold weather. The behavior of specific species under pressure, the landscapes that offered tactical advantages for approach or ambush. You had to know which animals were dangerous when cornered and which would bolt, which were easier to pursue in loose soil and which in open ground, which could be driven toward water where they became easier to kill. This knowledge accumulated across generations, encoded in stories and songs taught through apprenticeship and repeated experience and worth. In the most literal sense, the difference between eating and starving. By 40,000 years ago, humans had become the planet's apex predators, not through brute force, but through intelligence, endurance, coordination, and the terrifyingly patient application of physics to the problem of killing things larger than themselves. Within a few thousand years of arriving on any previously uninhabited continent, human hunters had driven many of the largest mammals to extinction, not through some sudden violence, but through the slow, relentless pressure of a predator that never stopped hunting, never slept long enough to miss an opportunity, and grew smarter and better armed with every generation. Here is the most persistent myth about Stone Age eating, that our ancestors were primarily meteors, stalking the landscape as lean and merciless predators, eating plants as a reluctant supplement when the hunt failed. This narrative is everywhere in the popular imagination, in diet, books, in the cultural iconography of cavemen, and it is wrong in a way that matters enormously for understanding what our bodies actually need. The archaeological and ethnographic evidence is consistent and clear. In most Stone Age populations, plant foods provided somewhere between 50 and 80% of total caloric intake, not as a supplement to meat, as the foundation. The reliable daily season-tuned foundation on which hunting was the spectacular but inconsistent bonus. Think about the basic arithmetic of hunting. Even skilled hunters in favorable environments might make a significant kill every few days. Weather turns bad, animals shift their routes, injuries sideline key hunters. A dozen hunts fail for everyone that succeeds. You cannot build a diet on something that is unreliable when children need to eat every day, when nursing mothers need consistent calories to maintain milk production, when elders need steady nutrition to remain functional contributors to the group. Plants, by contrast, don't run away. They're predictable within their seasons, harvestable in quantity, and diverse enough that when one source failed, others could be found. In virtually every foraging society we can actually study, the caloric math favors plants. The gathering economy was enormously complex. Underground storage organs, tubers, corns, bulbs were probably the most important plant foods across many environments. These are the parts of plants that store energy underground, protected from temperature extremes and most predators. Wild versions of what would eventually become potatoes, yams, taro, dense in carbohydrates, available year-round if you knew where to look, often accessible even when surface resources had disappeared during dry seasons. They were famine insurance. But harvesting them required knowledge that took generations to accumulate. Which plants to look for when only the above-ground parts were visible. How deep to dig for which species, which required cooking or processing to remove toxins, what digging tools to use in what soil types. A woman who knew the underground food landscape of a 50-square-mile territory, who could walk to a specific location, read the dried stem of a plant whose leaves had long vanished, and know that 2 feet down there was a fist-sized tuber worth the effort of digging, was one of the most valuable members of any group. This was not simple foraging. It was botanical expertise with survival stakes. Get it wrong and you poison yourself or your children. Forget it and you starve when the game disappears. The scope of plant knowledge required in a foraging society would stagger a modern botanist. Hundreds of species which were edible, in which seasons, which parts were safe, and which were toxic, which required processing, and what processing techniques made them safe, how to identify them at different growth stages, where they grew relative to water sources, soil types, and other vegetation. Getting it wrong meant poisoning. Forgetting it meant starvation. This was knowledge worth fighting for, worth encoding in ritual and song, worth transmitting with extraordinary care across every generation. We know this diversity existed because archaeologists have found it preserved in the most unexpected place. Hardened plaque on ancient teeth. Dental calculus, the crusty buildup that accumulates on teeth over a lifetime. Traps microscopic particles of food, starch grains from roots, phytoliths from grasses, pollen from flowers, plant fibers from leaves and stems. These particles can survive tens of thousands of years, and in recent decades, researchers have learned to analyze them with increasing precision. What they found in Stone Age teeth is astonishing. Some individuals show evidence of consuming more than 50 different plant species. Starch grains that had been heated indicating cooking. Ground plant particles suggesting use of grinding stones. Chemical modifications that only occur with specific preparation techniques. Our ancestors weren't eating whatever raw plants they stumbled across. They were processing, combining, cooking, and selecting plants with what can only be described as culinary sophistication. Even if the kitchen was an open fire and a flat stone, the diversity of what they ate, the skill with which they prepared it, the depth of ecological knowledge required to find it, all of this adds up to a portrait of human beings who were, by any reasonable measure, experts in the food systems they inhabited. In parts of Africa, nuts became a staple in certain regions. Incredibly nutritious, storable for long periods. Abundant enough in certain seasons that groups could structure significant portions of their annual movement around nut harvest. In Europe, hazelnuts filled a similar role. Archaeological sites show massive accumulations of hazelnut shells at certain locations, suggesting not casual gathering, but organized repeated return to productive groves. In the Middle East, wild cereals grew in dense enough stands that people were processing them with grinding stones long before anyone thought to plant them deliberately. The plant foods were not an afterthought. They were the calendar around which everything else was arranged. And there is one more thing that popular narratives consistently fail to acknowledge. In most foraging societies, we can actually observe women do the majority of plant gathering. This wasn't a marginal contribution. It was the economic backbone of Stone Age life. The patient daily skilled work of gathering plant foods carried out while also managing children, navigating complex social dynamics, maintaining the enormous botanical knowledge base required, and often ranging considerable distances across difficult terrain was what kept communities fed through lean seasons, through failed hunts, through the long winters when there was nothing to chase. The dramatic hunt was real and it mattered. But the invisible abundance that women pulled from the earth every single day was what made survival possible for everyone, including the hunters who get all the glory in popular accounts. On the southern coast of South Africa, at a place called Pinnacle Point, the sea has carved a series of caves into rugged limestone cliffs. Inside those caves, sealed in layers of sediment, archaeologists found something that pushed back our understanding of human dietary sophistication by tens of thousands of years: dense accumulations of shells, mussels, limpets, and other shellfish in deposits dating to roughly 164,000 years ago. Not a scattering of shells, not the remains of occasional meals, accumulations, mid-ends, the ancient equivalent of a kitchen trash can full of the evidence of repeated systematic organized eating. This was not casual beachcombing. The shells show signs of size selection, suggesting people were choosing individuals large enough to be worth the effort. Burn marks indicate systematic cooking. Cracking shells open with heat rather than tools, a technique that requires understanding the physics of thermal expansion and the behavior of the specific animals being harvested. The deposit layers appear and disappear seasonally, suggesting organized returns to these sites at particular times of year, probably timed to the periods when the shellfish were fattest and the tides most favorable. This was a managed resource carefully exploited by people who understood the rhythms of their marine environment well enough to plan their movements around it. Pinnacle Point is not unique. Similar patterns appear at multiple South African coastal sites and later across North Africa, the Eastern Mediterranean, and eventually virtually every coastline that humans reached. Wherever there were productive shores, people exploited them systematically, intelligently, and repeatedly over very long periods. The reason beyond simple caloric availability goes deeper into human biology. Consider DHA, docosahexaenoic acid, a long-chain omega-3 fatty acid that is a critical structural component of the human brain and retina. Your neurons build their membranes out of it. Without adequate DHA, brain development is impaired in ways that are measurable and persistent. You can synthesize modest amounts from plant precursors, but the process is inefficient. Your body converts only a few % of the plant-based precursor into usable DHA. Rich direct sources are rare on land. In marine environments, they're everywhere. In fatty fish, shellfish, marine mammals, even certain seaweeds, all sitting atop a food web saturated with omega-3s because the base of that food web, the phytoplankton, produces these fatty acids in abundance. Then there's iodine, which humans need for proper brain development and thyroid function. Severe iodine deficiency during development causes cretinism, profound cognitive impairment that is entirely preventable with adequate dietary iodine. Inland iodine can be scarce and irregularly distributed, dependent on local geology in ways that are impossible to predict without modern testing. Along coasts, it's abundant in seafood and seaweeds. Zinc, selenium, certain B vitamins all cluster in marine food webs in concentrations that are difficult to match through terrestrial foods alone. These aren't trivial dietary bonuses. They're the specific micronutrients that a large, metabolically expensive brain requires in order to develop properly, function well, and reproduce successfully. Shorelines were in a very real sense brain. Food concentrated and made accessible to anyone willing to wade through shallow water at low tide. Some researchers have suggested that the coastal migration hypothesis, the idea that early humans spread out of Africa by following coastlines rather than moving across open landscapes, is partly a story about nutritional access. A band following the edge of the sea could move thousands of miles while never being far from a reliable food supply. Shellfish don't migrate. They're attached to rocks. Tidal rhythms are predictable, more predictable in fact, than almost any terrestrial food source because they're governed by the moon rather than by rainfall or temperature. The learning curve for exploitation is short. Even children can gather shellfish effectively with no tools beyond their hands. Unlike hunting large game, coastal foraging carries minimal risk of catastrophic injury. This combination, high nutritional value, low risk, predictable availability, accessible to all members of a group, including children and elders, made coastal environments uniquely valuable for populations moving into unfamiliar territory. You didn't need to know local plants. You didn't need to track unfamiliar animals. You needed to find the shore and wait for low tide. Over time, coastal expertise deepened. Barbed bone points appear in the archaeological record. Specialized tools ideally suited for fishing and hunting in water, where the drag helps set the barbs against struggling prey. Fish bones accumulate at sites and quantities and species compositions that suggest not casual opportunism, but systematic seasonal exploitation of fish runs, organized harvesting of the annual salmon or eel migration, the periodic concentration of spawning fish in shallow water, the predictable gathering of cetaceans in certain bays at certain times of year. Evidence of traps, of organized shellfish harvesting, of people scheduling their movements around marine resources rather than simply incorporating them opportunistically. The coast was not a backup plan for many populations. It was the main stage of subsistence, the pantry that made mobility possible, and through its unusual concentration of brain-building nutrients, possibly one of the environments that helped push human cognitive evolution forward, one more increment in a long series of increments, stretching back to the first bone cracked in the African dust. For a long time, we drew Neanderthals as caricatures, brutish, dim, locked into a single behavioral mode of charging at large animals with crudely fashioned spears and ripping the meat off with their teeth. This image persists in popular culture, partly because it's convenient. It makes us the smart cousins and them the dead end, and partly because the earliest interpretations of the fossil record genuinely underestimated the complexity of their lives. Early analysis of Neanderthal anatomy focused on the ways they differed from modern humans. The heavy brow ridge, projecting midface, the stocky proportions. These differences were read as signs of inferiority rather than adaptation, as evidence of limited intelligence rather than specialized expertise in a particular ecological niche. The evidence we've accumulated since is considerably more interesting. Neanderthals were in certain environments and seasons among the most effective large game hunters Earth has ever produced. The nitrogen and carbon isotope ratios locked in their bones tell the story clearly. In northern and central Europe, from sites like Vindia Cave in Croatia to various French and German sites, Neanderthal dietary signatures cluster near or above apex carnivores. They were eating mammoth, woolly rhinoceros, steppe bison, and giant deer, not occasionally but habitually, as the primary source of their calories. They weren't scavenging scraps from predators. They were the predators. They were at the top of one of the most challenging food chains in the history of the planet. Hunting animals that weighed several tons in conditions that would kill an unprepared modern human within hours. Their skeletons bear the cost of this. Healed fractures, compressed spines, joint damage in patterns eerily similar to what modern rodeo riders accumulate. Injuries from close quarters encounters with large, dangerous animals that could fight back with lethal force. They hunted at near contact range, thrusting spears rather than throwing them, which means they were regularly within arm's reach of animals that weighed several tons and had reflexes faster than a human. The injuries they sustained and survived speak to both the danger of their hunting methods and the resilience of their bodies. People hunting woolly rhinoceros at close quarters did not do so carelessly. They had knowledge, strategy, and courage that would command respect in any era. This took bodies built for power, stocky, heavily muscled with enormous caloric requirements to maintain that muscle mass in cold climates. In northern Europe during peak glacial conditions, a diet dominated by animal fat and protein was not just culturally preferred. It was the only viable option. For months of the year, plant food simply didn't exist under the ice and snow. The tundra that stretched south from the glaciers was a landscape of frozen grass and bare stone, barren of the roots and fruits and seeds that plant-based diets require. In that context, the Neanderthal body, wide, short-lived, adapted to retain heat, capable of generating enormous muscular force, was not a failed experiment, but a remarkably successful specialization. Move south toward the Mediterranean and the picture changes. At Gibraltar, at coastal Italian sites in the Iberian Peninsula, Neanderthal food remains include shellfish, marine mammals, pine nuts, acorns, wild legumes. Microscopic plant remains in hearth ash, and on stone tools suggest systematic processing of tubers and seeds. The stereotype of the pure carnivore begins to dissolve into something more recognizable as opportunistic omnivory. The same behavioral flexibility that characterized our own ancestors applied in a different body with different emphasis. The most intimate window into Neanderthal diet comes from a cave in northern Spain called El Sidrón, where researchers analyzed dental calculus from individuals who lived around 49,000 years ago. What they found embedded in that ancient plaque was a ghost menu: heated starch grains from grasses and possibly wild barley, traces of nuts and mosses, and chemical signatures of bitter plants with no caloric value. Yarrow and chamomile, known in modern herbal medicine as anti-inflammatory and digestive aids. One individual with evidence of a dental abscess and gut parasites appears to have been consuming precisely the plants that would in a traditional herbal context be used to treat those conditions. Not randomly chewing on whatever was available, selecting specific plants for specific effects. self-medication 50,000 years ago by a species we spent most of the 20th century dismissing as cognitively primitive. The Neanderthal record also contains evidence of cannibalism at El Cedron at Crapper in Croatia, at Moula Geri in France. Hominin bones bearing cut marks in the same pattern as butchered animal bones, long bones cracked for marrow. What this meant is genuinely unclear. Some cases appear to reflect resource stress. Small groups, harsh winters, the desperate mathematics of survival when the only available calories were in the bodies of people who had already died. Others occur alongside evidence of careful burial and apparent ritual treatment of the dead, suggesting a more complex relationship with cannibalism than simple necessity. Both things can be true, that Neanderthal culture contained forms of reverence for the dead, and that extreme circumstances could override them. Humans do this too. The archaeological record of our own species contains evidence of cannibalism. That spans every period of our history. Taken whole, the Neanderthal menu was not one thing. It was a regionally and seasonally variable response to whatever environments they inhabited, sophisticated enough to include herbal medicine, complex enough to include marine foraging and plant processing, brutal enough to include hunting animals that could kill them on bad days, and desperate enough in some times and places to include other Neanderthals. They were not us, but they were not us, but they were more like us than we were comfortable admitting for a very long time. And here's the thing that recent genetics has added to this picture. They were not entirely separate from us either. Most people with ancestry outside of sub-Saharan Africa carry somewhere between 1 and 4% Neanderthal DNA. The genetic residue of interbreeding events that occurred when our ancestors first moved into Europe and Asia and encountered the people who had been there for 200,000 years before them. When you think about Neanderthal diet, you're not thinking about strangers. You're thinking about distant relatives whose genes still run in your body, contributing, among other things, to your immune responses, your adaptation to cold climates, and possibly your metabolism. In the modern Western world, eating insects is a dare, a television stunt, a novelty at a science museum gift shop. If you're eating grasshoppers, something has gone wrong, and everyone at the dinner table knows it. This attitude is historically and globally anomalous, a peculiarity of a few centuries of agricultural surplus in a handful of wealthy societies. And it obscures a dietary relationship that runs far deeper into our past than hunting or farming or anything else we've discussed so far. Insects were never the star of the meal. They were something better, reliable. They don't migrate to distant pastures when rains fail. They don't hide in shifting territories. Termites pack themselves into mounds that can be located, mapped and returned to year after year. Because termite colonies occupy the same mound for decades or centuries, bee colonies occupy hollow trees that persist for decades. Certain beetle larvae develop in fallen logs that remain in the same location season after season. Their presence predictable to anyone who knows which tree species they prefer and what stage of decomposition they require. Insects represent concentrated, predictable, low-risk protein and fat distributed throughout every terrestrial ecosystem on Earth, accessible to any creature clever enough to find them and patient enough to harvest them in quantity. The caloric case for insect eating is straightforward. Most edible insects are rich in complete protein, often matching or exceeding lean beef gram for gram. Many carry significant fat, particularly in larval and pupal stages, which function as little nutrient storage tanks, preparing the developing animal for metamorphosis. They're loaded with micronutrients, iron, zinc, B vitamins, calcium, from the exoskeleton if chewed and swallowed. A roasted grasshopper is nutritionally something like a multivitamin wrapped in protein. And the energy cost of obtaining a basket full is dramatically lower than the energy cost of tracking, chasing, and killing a large animal, which might take days of effort and still fail. You cannot fail to harvest termites from a termite mound if you know where the mound is and you arrive at the right time of year. The evidence that our pre-human ancestors were exploiting insects goes back surprisingly far. Stone tools from sites associated with early hominins show where patterns consistent with digging into hard earth. The kind of specific localized damage you'd accumulate breaking open termite mounds or prying bark from logs to access wood-boring lavi. The pattern is distinct from the wear produced by digging for roots or scraping bones, and researchers have become increasingly confident that it reflects deliberate insect harvesting rather than random tool use. Chimpanzees, our closest living Relatives use sticks as fishing tools to extract termites from mounds, inserting them, waiting, withdrawing them covered in biting insects, and eating them immediately. This behavior has been documented at multiple chimpanzee populations across Africa, suggesting it's an ancient capacity, not a recently learned trick. Extending this behavior to our tool using ancestors with their greater cognitive capacity and their understanding of seasonal patterns is not speculative. It's almost unavoidable. Among modern hunter-gatherer societies, the pattern is consistent across cultures and continents. The Hadza of Tanzania prize by larvae and other insects as seasonal delicacies, not famine foods. They're foods that elicit genuine enthusiasm that people look forward to, that children are taught to find and harvest from a young age. The San of Southern Africa harvest winged termites during nuptial flights when the insects emerge from their mounds in massive, briefly vulnerable swarms that can be captured in enormous quantities with minimal effort. Groups in the Amazon time. Their movements partly around the calendar of palm grubs, fat-loaded larvae that develop in the rotting trunks of felled palms and represent a predictable high-calorie seasonal resource that communities return to harvest year after year. In Australia, witchy grubs are dug from the roots of specific plants and eaten raw or lightly cooked, something children look forward to, not gagged down out of desperation. In Mexico, grasshoppers and ant eggs are still sold in markets. In Southeast Asia, a dozen species of insects appear on restaurant menus alongside more conventional proteins. The global picture is of insect eating as normal, valued, and often enjoyed, not as a desperate last resort, but as a real part of the food supply. Then there is honey. Humans share with very few other primates a nearly universal love of intense sweetness, and in wild landscapes, concentrated sugar is rare. Ripe fruit gives brief bursts of sweetness, but the sugar is diluted by water and fiber. Honey is something else entirely. A dense hit of simple sugars, fats from the comb, protein from bee larvae, micronutrients from stored pollen, all in one package. Some African rock art tens of thousands of years old appears to show figures climbing ropes toward bee nests while surrounded by swarms of small dots that may represent bees. The Hadza today will climb precarious trees, smoke out angry colonies, endure dozens of stings, and consider the whole experience a good time if the hive is productive. The payoff isn't just calories. It's the kind of caloric density that during a lean season could mean the difference between maintaining body weight and declining toward dangerous thinness. Honey in a pre-agricultural world was approximately equivalent to finding a cache of emergency rations. It was extraordinary luck that could sustain a group for days. Why did insects fall out of the Western diet? The answer is largely economic and cultural. Once cereal agriculture produced reliable grain surpluses, and once domesticated animals converted those surpluses into predictable meat, milk and fat, the daily risk of severe caloric shortfall dropped sharply for farming populations. Foods that existed primarily as insurance against scarcity started to look unnecessary. What is unnecessary in a culture with the luxury of choice gets reframed as undesirable, first as low status, then as disgusting, then as culturally prohibited. Religious and social norms layered on top of that economic shift. In some traditions, insects were associated with decay, filth, and the decomposition of the dead. In others, they simply fell out of the category of respectable food as grain and livestock became the twin pillars of civilized eating. And anything outside those pillars began to seem barbaric. But this is a cultural artifact, not a biological one. Your body carries no instruction to reject insects as food. What it carries is 3 million years of evolutionary history in which they were one of the most reliable caloric resources available, particularly in the lean seasons and hard years when everything else had failed. Every significant human food technology probably began as an accident. Fire might have been first encountered in the aftermath of a lightning-struck grassland. Someone noticed that the animals that died in the blaze tasted different from raw meat, that the charred tubers left in the cooling ash were softer and sweeter than the same roots eaten raw, and that eating them didn't make you sick the way eating raw roots sometimes did. The first stone tool was probably produced when someone striking rocks together for another purpose noticed that a sharp edge had formed, and the first fermented food was almost certainly something left in a damp spot too long, something that should have been disgusting but wasn't, something that tasted sour and slightly fizzy and oddly good whose consumption was, followed by a mysteriously comfortable stomach and a subtle shift in mood that nobody could explain but everyone could notice. These accidents accumulated over generations. Patterns were noticed. Certain preparations led to better outcomes. Roots buried in shaded, slightly damp pits kept longer than those left exposed. Meat hung near smoke from the fire lasted days instead of hours. Berries in a tight skin pouch, pressed by their own weight and a little warmth, began to fizz pleasantly after a few days and tasted different, sharper, stranger, somehow more interesting. The language to describe what was happening didn't exist yet. The microbes responsible for the transformation were invisible and would remain so for tens of thousands of years. But the results were observable, and humans are exceptional pattern recognizers. When a pattern consistently produces a useful outcome, humans encode it as practice, then habit, then tradition, then eventually sacred ritual. Fermentation, the transformation of food by microbial activity, is one of the oldest and most universally distributed food technologies on Earth. Ethnographers working with traditional communities across every continent have documented fermented foods made with minimal equipment, roots buried to soften and sour, seeds soaked until they begin to develop new flavors and reduce toxicity. Fish aged under stones in cool streams until they achieve a pungency that is to those who grew up eating them deeply appetizing. Honey diluted with water and left until it fizzes with a mildness that is pleasant rather than intoxicating. The specific practices vary enormously by culture and environment. The underlying principle, let microbes do some of the digestion for you and benefit from what they produce in the process, is everywhere. What fermentation does is remarkable in several dimensions at once. It preserves food by converting sugars into acids or alcohol that create an environment hostile to the dangerous. Bacteria responsible for spoilage and food-borne illness. It unlocks nutrients. Lactic acid fermentation can dramatically reduce the anti-nutrients in plant foods, making minerals more bioavailable and partially breaking down complex carbohydrates that the human gut cannot digest alone. It detoxifies. Certain plant toxins are neutralized by fermentation in ways that neither cooking nor drying can achieve. It creates entirely new flavor compounds. The sharp tartness of fermented roots, the complex savory depth of aged meat, the mild effervescence of fermented honey. These flavors aren't random. They signal at a level below conscious awareness that the food has been transformed in ways that generally make it safer and more nutritious. Our attraction to sour fermented flavors may be an ancient evolved preference, a sensory shortcut that guided our ancestors toward foods that the microbial world had already processed on their behalf. The storage side of the proteinatory is equally significant, and somewhat more visible in the archaeological record. Archaeologists have identified pits in late Stone Age sites that don't match the profile of simple trash dumps. Their walls are deliberately lined with stone or packed clay. Some show evidence of repeated use over many seasons, layers of organic material alternating with layers of ash, suggesting a pattern of filling, using, refilling. In cooler climates, meat could be cached in permafrost cracks or deep caves where year-round cold acted as natural refrigeration, preserving protein through months when hunting was impossible. Along coasts, fish bones accumulate at some sites in quantities far beyond what day-to-day eating would produce. Evidence of bulk processing during seasonal runs, drying and smoking catches to extend their useful life far beyond the brief window of abundance. The strings of dried fish hung over racks, slowly darkening in the smoke, are among the most ancient forms of food technology we can identify with confidence. Storage changes everything about how a social group can organize itself. If you can carry abundance forward in time, if the surplus from a successful hunt or a rich plant harvest can be preserved and accessed weeks or months later, then the relationship between food and territory changes fundamentally. You can range farther from water sources without carrying everything with you because you know that a cache waits at a fixed point. You can survive lean seasons that would kill groups without these skills. You can develop trade relationships, exchanging preserved foods across distances that would be impossible for fresh food. Building the networks of mutual obligation that are the foundation of complex societies. Stored food is also wealth. Quiet underground invisible wealth. And wealth creates new social dynamics that didn't exist in a world where everyone ate what they could carry and nothing more. Who owns the cash? Who has the right to access it? And under what conditions? What obligations does a group incur when they draw on someone else's surplus during a lean season? These questions don't have obvious answers, and working them out requires exactly the kinds of negotiation, memory of past exchanges, and anticipation of future interactions that complex social life requires. The proto-pantry doesn't just solve the problem of seasonal scarcity. It creates the problem of property. And with property comes politics, hierarchy, and all the complexities of human social life that followed inevitably from the moment when one group had more calories than they could eat and another group had less than they needed to survive. The idea of 3 meals a day would have struck any Stone Age human as an odd fantasy. Not aspirational, just conceptually strange. Meals did not arrive by clock. They arrived by weather, by migration timing, by whether the routes happened to be accessible in frozen ground, by whether the hunt that week had gone well or badly, by whether the river had fish in it or not. You ate when you found food in whatever quantity was available, as much as your stomach could hold. Then you stopped, not because you'd reached a reasonable caloric target, but because there was nothing else within reach worth the energy of obtaining it. The rhythm of eating in the Stone Age was written in the landscape, not in habit. And for most of human history, that rhythm took the shape of a long, slow wave, months of relative scarcity, then a burst of abundance so extreme it was almost absurd. The seasonal flood of calories when the herds were fat and moving through your territory. When fruits were ripe across miles of landscape simultaneously, when the salmon run hit its peak and the river was almost more fish than water. These were not regular occurrences. They were events. And the rational response to an event was to eat as much as possible as quickly as possible, and to process and preserve as much as you could in whatever time remained before the abundance moved on or spoiled. Modern hunter-gatherers do this routinely. Ethnographers describe people eating several thousand calories in a single sitting after a major kill, then lying contentedly for hours, moving slowly, laughing about swollen bellies, the way that satisfied people in every culture laugh about having eaten too much when too much was exactly the right amount. This is not gluttony in any moral sense. It is a physiological program that was honed over millions of years by a world in which today's abundance was genuinely uncertain tomorrow, in which a belly full of fat was not a health risk but a survival reserve, in which the body's instruction was always the same. When food is available, eat, store what you can, the lean times will come. The other end of the curve, the lean periods, was equally formative and physiologically as important as the feast. As seasons turned, as fruits vanished, and herds moved beyond easy range, and rivers shrank, and the ground froze over, the tubers you'd been counting on, meals, changed character. Smaller, more monotonous, extracted with increasing effort from an environment that was yielding less. Sometimes one substantial meal a day, sometimes just one small one, sometimes a day or two with almost nothing except water and whatever fiber could be chewed from fibrous stems or dried roots. In that world, intermittent fasting was not a wellness trend coined by someone with a podcast. It was the backdrop of existence, the normal, expected, manageable counterpart to the feast. And from the perspective of your cells, this stop and start, feast and famine pattern was normal in the deepest possible sense. It was the expectation around which metabolism evolved over millions of years. During the feast, glucose surged into the bloodstream. Insulin rose, short-term glycogen reserves refilled in the liver and muscles, and the overflow was converted into triglycerides and stored as fat under the skin and around the organs. As hours passed and no new food arrived, blood sugar slowly fell. The liver's glycogen reserves drained. Hormones signaled fat cells to begin releasing their stored cargo. Fatty acids entered the bloodstream. In the liver, some of those fatty acids were converted into ketone bodies, molecules that can feed muscles, organs, and crucially, the brain itself when glucose becomes scarce. Modern biologists call this metabolic flexibility, the ability to move smoothly between burning sugars in the fed state and burning fats in the fasted state. In the Stone Age, this wasn't a fitness metric tracked in a phone app. It was a prerequisite for being alive at all. Individuals whose bodies could slide into fat burning when carbohydrates were unavailable and do so without the mental fogginess, trembling, and physical weakness that severe hypoglycemia produces, were the ones who could still track animals on day 3 of an unsuccessful hunt, still make good decisions about which direction to travel when they hadn't eaten in 36 hours. Those individuals survived. Those individuals reproduced. Those individuals passed their metabolic flexibility to you. The social dimensions of feasting were inseparable from the metabolic ones and deserve more attention than they typically receive in nutritional histories. When a large animal fell, a mammoth, a bison, a large elk in winter, when the herd was penned by snow in a narrow valley, No small band could consume it before it spoiled. The meat would go bad in days. The bones could be cracked and rendered for longer. But the window of abundance was real and brief. News traveled. Smoke signals. Runners dispatched along familiar paths, shouted calls across the still air. Neighboring groups arrived, sometimes from considerable distances. There was work first, systematic butchering, sorting fat from lean, deciding what to roast immediately over a fire large enough to be seen for miles, and what to cut thin and hang on racks to dry in the cold air, and what to crack and smoke for the marrow. Children ran between the fires. Dogs, if dogs had been domesticated yet in this particular time and place, circled hopefully at the edges. Then, as the first meat crisped over coals, and the smell of rendering fat drifted across the camp, something happened that was as important as the calories themselves. Information exchanged. Marriages arranged. Old disputes quietly settled over shared food in the way that shared food has always softened negotiations. Objects traded across distances that would have taken days to travel alone. Stories told about the hunt, about the animals themselves, their behavior, their weakness, the technique that had finally worked. Stories told about other things too. Because a full belly and a warm fire and the company of people you don't see often enough unlocks a particular kind of generous, expansive mood that has probably characterized human social life since long before we were technically human. The feast converted calories into more than body fat. It converted them into memory, obligation, and social cohesion. Abundance was stored not only in bellies and hidden caches, but in relationships, in the unwritten ledger of who had shared what with whom, and what was therefore owed in return, and what could therefore be asked when times turned lean again. That ledger was arguably the foundation of human civilization. Your body still runs this ancient software. The hormones that regulate your hunger and satiety, leptin from fat cells, grain from the stomach, insulin from the pancreas, are exquisitely calibrated for short-term fluctuations but poorly equipped for permanent abundance. Your fat cells are eager to receive and reluctant to release. Because for most of evolutionary history, a generous fat reserve was insurance, not liability. And individuals who released their reserves too easily died in hard seasons. Your brain's reward circuits respond to sugar and fat with powerful positive signals. Because those were rare jackpots scattered through a sea of fibrous, low-calorie, hard-won food. And individuals who responded with enthusiasm when those jackpots appeared ate more of them and survived better than individuals who responded with indifference. What those circuits were not calibrated for was a world where the feast never ends and the famine never arrives, where you can graze from waking to sleep on foods engineered by teams of scientists to maximize the very signals your ancient reward system finds irresistible. The mismatch between ancient biology and modern abundance is not a moral failing. It is a calibration problem. Your body isn't broken. It's simply running very old code on very new hardware in a world its designers never anticipated. The skeleton is not a neutral record. Every stress leaves a mark if you know how to read them. The faint horizontal lines on tooth enamel called enamel hyperlas that form when growth pauses during a period of illness or malnutrition. The porous patches around the eye sockets and in the skull roof called cribra orbitalia that signal chronic anemia. The worn joint surfaces that accumulate over decades of physical labor. The bone density that reflects either a lifetime of load-bearing movement or its troubling absence. Taken individually, these marks tell stories about particular people. Taken across hundreds of skeletons from the same region and time period, they begin to speak in statistics to describe not individual lives, but the population-level experience of a particular way of eating and moving through the world. When you look at late Stone Age hunter-gatherer skeletons through this lens, a consistent picture emerges that surprises most people who haven't encountered it before. These were not people ground down by unrelenting hardship, though. The hardship was certainly real. Many show robust bone density, thick cortical walls, powerful muscle attachment points, the structural signature of bodies that were used. Hard and responded by growing strong. The femurs and tibers of people who walked long distances every day of their lives, who carried heavy loads, who squatted for hours while processing food, who climbed trees and hauled carcasses and dug soil. These bones look different from ours. They have a different weight in the hand, a different solidity. Conditions like severe osteoporosis, bones so thin that simple falls shatter hips and wrists, appear to have been much less common than in later sedentary agricultural populations because the mechanical stimulus of constant physical load kept the bone-building process running at high capacity throughout life. The teeth tell a particularly interesting story that gets surprisingly little attention in popular discussions of ancestral health. In many pre-agricultural populations, cavities are surprisingly rare. Gum disease tends to be mild. Tooth loss in middle adulthood is less common than in early farming communities. This is paradoxical on its surface. These people had no toothbrushes, no fluoride, nothing resembling modern dental care. But the explanation lies in what they were not eating. Refined sugars and finely milled starches that bacteria can ferment into tooth-dissolving acids. Their carbohydrates arrived wrapped in fiber. Roots that required sustained chewing and produced significant abrasion. Wild fruits with tough skins, seeds and nuts ground on stone but never to the talcum-fine consistency of modern flour. The mechanical action of chewing fibrous food cleaned teeth better than any brush. Food cleared more easily from tooth surfaces. Blood sugar surged less abruptly, giving bacteria less sustained access to fermentable substrate. The bacteria that cause cavities had a harder time finding a permanent foothold. When agriculture arrived and with it diets heavy and soft, sticky, refined carbohydrate foods, poor flatbreads, processed grains that stick to teeth and provide a long-lasting feast for oral bacteria, the dental record changed dramatically. Cavity rates jumped. Abscesses appeared in jaws that had been largely clean for hundreds of thousands of years. Tooth loss in young and middle-aged adults became common enough to be the rule rather than the exception in many farming populations. The introduction of refined carbohydrates was for the teeth a catastrophe, one whose full effects echoed forward into every subsequent civilization that built itself on grain and whose legacy we're still living with today in the form of one of the most prevalent chronic diseases in the modern world. This doesn't mean the Stone Age was a golden age of effortless health. It absolutely was not. Pre-agricultural skeletons contain plenty of healed fractures, arms broken in falls, ribs cracked in conflicts or accidents, skulls bearing the marks of blows that were survived. There was violence. Skeletal trauma consistent with interpersonal conflict appears throughout the record. In virtually every population archaeologists have studied, there were parasites, many of them, living in guts that never had access to antiparasitic medications. There were infections that could become fatal within days in the absence of any effective treatment. There were children who didn't survive infancy, and their absence from adult burial sites doesn't mean they didn't exist. It means they died too young to be commemorated in ways that have survived to the present. But the pattern of disease was different. The skeletons show a different distribution of damage, the damage of physical use, of acute injuries, of specific occupational stresses rather than the slow systemic whole body, metabolic failures that characterize the chronic disease burden of modern populations. The diseases that fill hospital beds today, type 2 diabetes, cardiovascular disease, obesity, the inflammatory conditions that underlie modern morbidity, leave signatures in the skeleton, and those signatures are largely absent from the pre-agricultural record. This isn't because prehistoric people were healthier in some simple universal sense. It's because the specific mismatches between ancestral biology and modern food environments hadn't been created yet. The bones also challenged the myth that our ancestors all died young. Life expectancy at birth was low. Infant mortality was devastating, and it drags any population average down sharply. If half of all children die before age 5, the average lifespan for the whole population might be 35, even if every adult who survives childhood lives to be 70. Life expectancy at birth and life expectancy conditional on surviving childhood are very different numbers, and popular accounts rarely distinguish between them. Archaeological sites contain elders, skulls with heavily worn teeth and extensive dental attrition, vertebrae with fused joints and calcified ligaments, long bones thin and remodeled at the ends in the way that only decades of use and slow mineral loss over time produces. These were people who lived long enough to be grandparents, long enough to carry the accumulated botanical and geographical knowledge that a foraging community depended on, long enough to remember bad years and tell younger people what had worked and what hadn't. That knowledge stored not in libraries or databases, but in human memory and oral tradition, maintained by the presence and longevity of the people who held it, was one of the most valuable resources a Stone Age community could possess. The gut doesn't fossilize the way bone does. Intestines vanish within hours of death. The living, shifting communities of microbes that once populated those dark spaces disappear almost immediately, leaving no trace that modernized. Chemistry can read from bare bone or bare soil, and yet traces remain. In coprolites, the fossilized feces occasionally preserved in dry caves and rock shelters where the combination of mineral-rich sediment and extremely low humidity can preserve organic material for tens of thousands of years. In dental calculus, which traps microbial DNA alongside food particles in a mineral matrix hard enough to survive almost indefinitely, and in the gut microbiomes of people who still live in ways that echo, however imperfectly, the dietary patterns of the deep past. What these sources collectively suggest is striking, and for many people unsettling. Your Stone Age ancestors carried a gut microbial ecosystem that was richer, more diverse, and almost certainly more dynamic than the one that most people living in industrialized societies carry today. Not richer in quantity. You still have trillions of bacteria, roughly as many microbial cells as human cells in your body, but richer in variety, more species, more ecological niches occupied, more functional redundancy, a more complex internal food web capable of processing a wider range of dietary inputs and producing a wider range of beneficial compounds. When researchers sampled the gut bacteria of the Hadza of Tanzania, they found that the gut bacteria of the Hadza of Tanzania were similar to those of other humans. One of the few remaining populations still living largely by hunting and gathering, their diet still containing significant quantities of wild tubers, berries, baobab fruit, honey, and hunted meat. They found bacterial groups that are extremely rare or entirely absent in industrialized populations. These weren't exotic bacteria unique to the Hadza. They were bacteria that appear to have been widespread in human guts before the dietary changes of the last few centuries began to filter them out. They also found pronounced seasonal shifts. In the dry season, when meat and tubers dominate the diet, certain bacterial communities flourish. In the wet season, when berries and honey become available and the plant diversity of the diet expands, the microbial composition of the gut changes significantly. The internal ecosystem breathes with the landscape, expanding one community and contracting another in response to the changing chemistry of what passes through it. The gut was not static environment. It was a dynamic one tuned to the rhythms of the natural world in ways that have no equivalent in a diet built on food that is available in identical form year-round from a climate-controlled supermarket. Understanding why this matters requires understanding what gut bacteria actually do, which is considerably more than most people realize. Most dietary fiber, the tough complex carbohydrates in plant cell walls, the resistant starches and cooked then cooled foods, the inulin and pectin and arabanoxylan, and dozens of other compounds that make up the structural matrix of plant foods passes through the small intestine without being digested and arrives intact in the large intestine where the microbial community lives. To the bacteria, these undigested compounds are dinner. They ferment them into short-chain fatty acids, but acetate propionate molecules that are anything but trivial to human health. Butyrate is the preferred fuel source of the cells that line the colon. Without adequate butyrate, those cells become stressed. The tight junctions between them begin to loosen, and the barrier that separates the contents of the gut from the rest of the body, a barrier whose integrity is fundamental to human health, begins to degrade. Short-chain fatty acids also regulate blood sugar by influencing insulin sensitivity, communicate with the immune system through receptors on immune cells distributed throughout the gut, and produce signals that travel via the vagus nerve to the brain, influencing mood, appetite, and stress responses in ways that modern neuroscience is still working to fully characterize. A Stone Age person eating a varied diet rich in wild plant foods, tubers, roots, leaves, seeds, nuts, fruits, bark, fibrous stems, was providing a continuous diverse supply of these microbial fuels. Their guts would have been metabolically noisy with fermentation, producing large quantities of short-chain fatty acids and whatever other compounds particular microbial communities generated from the particular substrates available to them. Their microbial communities would have been broad, well-fed and functionally diverse in ways that provided multiple overlapping mechanisms for keeping the gut lining intact, the immune system calibrated, and the brain-gut communication pathway active. Modern Western diets built on highly refined grains, added sugars and processed foods with most fiber removed effectively starve this system. Complex fiber that never reaches the large intestine because it was removed during food processing means the microbial community has nothing to ferment. Species that specialize in breaking down complex plant material have no substrate and decline, slowly, generation by generation, as their populations shrink and their genes are passed less frequently to the next generation of microbes. The ecosystem simplifies. The rich, diverse, functionally complex rainforest of the ancestral gut becomes, in the language of modern microbiome research, something closer to a monoculture. Still present, still functional in some basic ways, but stripped of much of its ecological complexity and the resilience that complexity provides. This matters for reasons that extend well beyond digestion. The immune system grew up negotiating with the microbial world. From the moment a Stone Age baby was born, covered in its mother's vaginal and skin bacteria, laid directly on soil or animal skin, never bathed in antimicrobial soap, its immune cells began sorting friend from foe. Breast milk carried not just nutrients but specialized sugars that fed specific beneficial bacteria. Dirt on the ground, hair on animal skins, insect parts in food, harmless worms in the soil encountered during play, all contributed to a continuous stream of microbial information for the developing immune system. This was a training curriculum. Cells learned not to overreact to harmless environmental compounds. They learned to tolerate the microbes that helped process fiber and produce vitamins. They learned to respond forcefully when genuine pathogens appeared, and crucially, they learned to distinguish between the two. A calibration that requires continuous exposure to a wide variety of microbial and non-microbial signals throughout development and beyond. In modern environments, many of those signals have been turned down or eliminated. Clean water, sewage systems, and antibiotics have saved countless lives and represent some of the greatest public health achievements in human history. Child mortality has plummeted. Diseases that once ravaged villages now rarely appear. But along the way, the ancient curriculum of the immune education has changed in ways that may have consequences we're still working to understand. The old friends hypothesis suggests that many of the immune calibration problems that characterize modern developed societies, certain allergies, autoimmune conditions, inflammatory bowel diseases, some forms of asthma, reflect a mismatch between the rich microbial education that our immune systems evolved to receive and the impoverished microbial environment that industrialization created. The immune system didn't stop being vigilant. It simply has fewer legitimate threats to practice on. And in the absence of those threats, it sometimes directs its vigilance at things it shouldn't. The conversation between your body and the microbes that live in it is not a recent scientific discovery. It is one of the oldest biological relationships on Earth, built across hundreds of millions of years of coevolution between animal bodies and the microbial world. You just have somewhat fewer participants in the conversation than your ancestors did, and some of what you're missing may matter more than we yet understand. The first wheat field didn't look like a field. It looked like a stubborn patch of grass near a seasonal stream. Thin stalks, small seeds, nothing that would attract a second glance from someone walking by in a hurry. For hundreds of thousands of years, those seeds were just one more thing to gather here and there. A side dish, a crunchy snack, a bit of starchy insurance when hunting was bad and roots ran low. Then, sometime around 11,000 years ago, in the arc of fertile land stretching from the Levant through Anatolia into the foothills of the Zagros Mountains, something shifted. People who had been gathering wild wheat and barley for generations began doing something quietly transformative. Returning to the same patches year after year, removing competing plants without calling it weeding, dropping seeds near camp without calling it planting, noticing that grain grew thicker where soil had been disturbed by digging or where last year's cooking waste had been dumped. They weren't reading agricultural manuals. They weren't attending meetings about transitioning to a farming economy. They were doing what humans have always done, noticing patterns, responding to them, and gradually, incrementally, changing their relationship to their food environment in ways whose full consequences none of them could have anticipated. This happened independently in different forms in at least 7 or 8 places around the world. In the Yellow River valleys of China with millet, and later rice in the highlands of what is now Mexico with a scraggly, barely edible grass called teyunt, that would eventually, over thousands of years of human selection, become maize, one of the most productive and widely grown food plants in history. In the highlands of New Guinea, along the Nile in West Africa, in the Andes in parts of India, and Southeast Asia, not once but many times in many places, people began nudging landscapes in a particular direction, nudging plants toward greater yield and reduced toxicity and more reliable production, nudging the relationship between human groups and their food sources away from the old pattern of following abundance and toward the new pattern of creating it. The consequences were enormous and deeply ambivalent. Agriculture can support many more people per unit of land than foraging. Even if each person is somewhat less well-nourished, the total population can be much larger because the same territory that might support a few dozen foragers can support hundreds or thousands of farmers. And once farming populations began to grow, they could displace neighboring foragers through sheer demographic weight. The way a faster reproducing species can displace a slower one from shared territory without ever meeting in direct conflict. The transition once started became self-reinforcing in ways that made reversal nearly impossible. Once your landscape has been cleared of forest to plant fields, the wild food sources that a foraging lifestyle depends on are gone. Once your population has grown to a size that only agriculture can support, you cannot simply stop farming and return to gathering. There isn't enough wild food left to feed. The number of mouths that agriculture created. But look at the bodies. Archaeologists who examine skeletons from the same region before and after the agricultural transition consistently find a troubling pattern that has been replicated at sites across the globe. Average stature drops sometimes by several centimeters in just a few thousand years, a pace that is dramatic by evolutionary standards. Dental health deteriorates sharply. Cavities, abscesses, and early tooth loss become common as sticky. Refined carbohydrate diets replace the diverse fibrous foods that had kept mouths relatively clean for hundreds of thousands of years. Skeletal markers of anemia and vitamin deficiency appear with increasing frequency, suggesting that despite having more calories available, early farmers were often getting less nutritional diversity. Childhood growth disruptions visible as lines in tooth enamel and disruptions in bone growth plates become more frequent, suggesting that early farming children experienced more episodes of illness and nutritional stress than their foraging predecessors. More stress, not less, despite ostensibly having more food security. This is the agricultural paradox. More people less well-nourished on average, subject to new disease burdens created by the crowding and sanitation challenges of settled life, dependent on a narrow range of crops that could fail catastrophically in ways that the diverse foraging diet never could. Yet the system perpetuated itself and eventually conquered the world, not because it was better for individuals, but because it produced more individuals. And more individuals, regardless of their average health, tend to outcompete fewer individuals over time. The biological responses to this new dietary reality are written in modern human DNA, evidence that evolution didn't stop when farming began, but accelerated, driven by the intense new selective pressures of settled agricultural life. In populations with long histories of dairying cattle, goats, or camels, mutations that keep lactase active into adulthood spread rapidly because in drought or crop failure, the ability to draw calories from livestock's milk could be the difference between survival and starvation. Today, whether you can drink a glass of milk without digestive distress is a direct reflection of your ancestors' agricultural choices, encoded in your genome through thousands of years of natural selection. Similarly, populations with long histories of starchy crops tend to carry more copies of the amylase gene, the enzyme that begins breaking down starch in saliva. More copies mean more enzyme, a head start on digesting starch before it even reaches the stomach. The agricultural world left its mark on the genome not through some grand single evolutionary event, but through the steady, relentless pressure of survival. Individuals who could extract more nutrition from the available food, surviving better, reproducing more successfully, passing on the variants that helped them do it generation by generation for 10,000 years. Underneath these adaptations, however, the deeper architecture remains. The gut expecting varied, fibrous seasonal food. The metabolism calibrated for feast and famine rather than constant surplus. The reward system that responds powerfully to sugar and fat because they were rare in the ancestral environment. We built an agricultural civilization on top of a Paleolithic body, then an industrial civilization on top of that, then a digital one on top of that. Each layer adding new mismatches between biological expectation and the reality of lived experience. We are living at the intersection of all those histories simultaneously. And our bodies are doing their best to make sense of a world they were never designed for. running software that evolved for one operating environment on hardware that now inhabits something entirely different. You've traveled a long way tonight, from the edge of a predator's kill-in. Plain, Ethiopia to the limestone caves of Ice Age Europe. From tidal flats at dawn to the first grain fields of the Fertile Crescent. From the deep, fermenting darkness of storage pits to the metabolic complexity of a gut microbiome shaped by millions of years of wild, fibrous, variable food. That's a considerable distance to cover before sleep. And yet somehow it brings you back to exactly where you started in a body that carries all of it. Every layer, every adaptation, every ancient memory encoded in metabolism and microbiome and the deep architecture of appetite. The temptation at the end of a journey like this is to reduce it to a prescription. To say, here is what you should eat, here is the correct meal, here is the ancestral template that modern nutrition got wrong. Resist that temptation. Not because the history isn't relevant, it is profoundly, but because the most important lesson of 3.5 million years of human eating is that there was never one diet. There were thousands Arctic hunters who derived 90% of their calories from animal fat and built functional, healthy lives on it. Coastal foragers who lived primarily on shellfish and fish and grew the largest, most cognitively sophisticated brains on the planet. Tropical forest groups relying on tubers, fruit, and insects. Their guts lush with microbial diversity. Their metabolisms tuned to the seasonal rhythm of the rainforest. Early farmers building lives around wheat and barley while still gathering wild greens from field margins, still hunting when they could, still fermenting and storing and processing food in ways that preserved some connection to the older world their bodies remembered. Every environment, every season, every period shaped a different menu. The diversity was the point. The adaptability was the survival strategy. What unified all of these wasn't a specific food or macronutrient ratio. It was variety, seasonality, and whole foods. Foods that arrived in the forms ecosystems produced them. Not stripped of fiber and fortified with synthetic vitamins and engineered to be hyper-palatable in ways that override the satiety signals your body needs to regulate intake. It was movement woven through eating, the walking to find food, the physical work of gathering and hunting and processing and carrying the absence of any separation between the caloric output required to obtain food and the caloric input that food provided. It was a relationship with hunger that treated it as a signal rather than an emergency. That understood the difference between the mild, productive hunger of a body shifting smoothly into fat burning and the dangerous hunger of genuine starvation. And that allowed the former without panic or immediate suppression. What does that understanding actually suggest practically for someone in a 21st century body navigating a 21st century food environment? A few things emerge clearly from the evidence, not as rules but as directions worth. Considering more unrefined plant foods. Not because fiber is a magic substance, but because it's what your gut bacteria evolved to ferment. What keeps your microbial ecosystem complex and functional. What your colonics rely on as their primary fuel. More variety across seasons if at all possible. Different fruits, vegetables, roots, and grains in rotation rather than the same 5 foods every day of every week of every year. Fermented foods made with live cultures, yogurt, kefir, kimchi, properly fermented pickles as a gesture toward the ever-present microbial richness of the ancestral food environment. A way of continuing a relationship that your body was designed to maintain. Less reliance on the highly processed, low-fiber, high-sugar products that flood the modern food supply that feed a tiny subset of your microbial ecosystem while starving everything else. That trigger the ancient reward signals for sugar and fat in ways that were adaptive in a world of scarcity, but become problematic in a world of permanent abundance. And beyond the specifics of what, a closer attention to when and how much. Your metabolism was not designed for constant feeding. The shift from burning glucose to burning fat that happens during a normal overnight fast is not a deprivation state, not a crisis, not something your body fights against. It's a normal, healthy metabolic mode that your body has been running for millions of years that your cells are well equipped to handle that may in fact be beneficial in ways that modern research is only beginning to characterize. The mild hunger before a meal is not an emergency that must be immediately suppressed. The fullness after a substantial, satisfying meal is a signal worth listening to rather than overriding with something sweet because the meal is technically over, but the dessert menu exists. The rhythm of eating and not eating, of abundance and relative scarcity, was baked into your physiology long before you had any say in the matter. There is something else worth carrying away from this journey. Something harder to quantify than dietary fiber or microbiome diversity or metabolic flexibility. The people whose meals we've been following tonight. Scavengers crouching over predator kills with rough stone tools in their hands. Foragers digging tubers in hard soil in the midday sun. Hunters tracking herds across frozen tundra for days. Shellfish gatherers wading through the tidal flats at dawn with skin bags slung over their shoulders were not eating alone. Food was never just nutrition. It was the occasion for all the things that make humans distinctly human. Cooperation, communication, teaching, ritual, care for the young and the old. The transmission of accumulated knowledge across generations through story and song and demonstration. The hearth was a classroom. The feast was a social contract. The shared meal was the original human institution predating religion, government, writing, and all the other things we tend to think of as the foundations of civilization. When your ancestors sat around a fire dividing cooked meat and roasted roots, deciding without formal procedure who got the richest cuts and who got the scraps and what obligations that distribution created for the future, they were doing something that was simultaneously biological and social, individual and communal, practical and deeply meaningful. The two dimensions were inseparable then, and they remain entangled now, even if we have mostly stopped noticing. That inseparability is part of your inheritance too. The comfort of a meal shared with people you trust. The satisfaction of food you prepared yourself from recognizable ingredients with a process you can trace from beginning to end. The pleasure of a table that reflects seasonal abundance rather than industrial homogeneity. These aren't just preferences, just aesthetic choices, just the kind of thing you're into. They're old signals running on very old hardware trying to tell you something about what eating was always for and what it still needs to be in order to feel complete rather than merely sufficient. You don't need to be an archaeologist to hear them. You just need to pay attention. Notice which breakfast carries you comfortably to midday and which leaves you hungry again in an hour. Notice whether your energy and mood shift when plants arrive on your plate in variety and color rather than monotony. Notice how your body feels the morning after a meal built from whole, recognizable ingredients versus one built from something that arrived in a package with a list of 40 ingredients, half of them unfamiliar. These are not tricks of imagination or the placebo effect of reading about ancestral health. They're your body running ancient diagnostics, comparing inputs against 3 million years of accumulated calibration data and reporting back honestly in the only language it has, sensation. The Deep Time Kitchen is not a place you visit for nostalgia. It's the laboratory where your body was built, the testing ground where everything about your physiology was refined across unimaginable stretches of time. And it's still running in every cell, every metabolic pathway, every microbial negotiation happening in your gut right now. As you process the day's food, regulate the chemistry of sleep, perform quietly extraordinary feats of biochemistry that billions of years of evolution prepared you to perform without a single conscious thought. Somewhere very far back, your ancestors are gathered around a small fire. The dark is wide and full of sound, insects, distant water. The occasional crack of something moving through dry grass at the edge of the firelight. The smell of smoke and roasted meat and something earthy herbal sits in the cool air. Someone is telling a story. Children are sleeping under skins, their bellies full for the first time in days. Their faces relaxed in the deep, uncomplicated way that only the fully fed and truly safe can sleep. An elder is cracking a bone with practiced efficiency, getting at the last of the marrow, wasting nothing. Someone else is banking the fire for the night, adding a slow-burning log that will still be smoldering at dawn. Tomorrow is uncertain. It always was. But tonight there is warmth and food and company and the particular kind of contentment that comes from a belly fed and a body that knows without being told that this is what it was made for. Rest well. Your ancient body knows what to do from.